I mean, I hope you've been able to listen to what some of my guests have said before. We're really trying to have a sort of very open and calm and constructive conversation around this. Where do you stand on critical race theory? Is it sort of a necessary process that we must go through, or do you see that perhaps it's being sort of diluted down into something that's become polarising?
So I think we have to be clear on the definition, first and foremost. And obviously, critical race theory ultimately is a study of law and infrastructures upon which racial inequality is based upon. And so it offers a set of approaches that allow us to understand the way in which racial unfairness has been interwoven into society. And so I think that it's an excellent opportunity to understand the legacy of racism. And also, I think it's an opportunity to gain a greater understanding of how the past informs the future. And of course, that in turn should allow us to intervene and find the necessary solutions in regards to combating racial disparities. So I think it's a very important part of our growth.
This is a theory that's largely come out of America, and America's legacy is quite different from ours in terms of, in living memory of a great number of Americans, they had segregation. You know, that didn't really finish until the mid-60s. And you can see straight away how that sort of burning separation, those burning divisions, still have tendrils in society in America today. Whereas in the UK, it's quite a different history. Colonially, Britain, without doubt, divided peoples. But that division tended to happen off-site, not so much on our own soil. Do you think that taking something born in America and just directly transplanting it into a UK-centric debate actually works?
I think English people are very quick to separate ourselves from America in regards to the history of colonialism and racism. And secondly, we tend to put racism into a homogenous box, and we don't tend to deal with the actual details. And in actual fact, racism is three distinct forms: institutionalized racism, overt racism, and covert racism. As a society, we focus on overt racism, and therefore we separate ourselves from America because America tends to exhibit the most forms of overt racism. But that does not negate the fact that racism is very much prevalent in this society. So I think it's really important to understand that we are all in this together. There is no separation in regards to racism. Racism manifests here just like it manifests in America. And so I think it's really important to understand that before we even begin to say that we're separating ourselves from England, or America rather.
Well, why do you think whenever people try and have a conversation about this, it has a tendency to regress into two warring factions, where there's one half of the debate saying, I feel under attack, I'm not a racist, this is not a racist country, we must stop saying that about Great Britain. Yep. And then other people saying, well, you know, walk a day in my shoes, experience things the way I've experienced things. And you were breaking the, you know, covert racism, institutional and overt. And I think that's a really valid point to make. Do you think that we can be reconciled? And how do we do that? How do we actually have... You and I are able to have a very open and adult conversation about this, but this really is rare. This rarely tends to happen.
I think that... Well, firstly, in regards to critical race theory, I think we should start at the heart of critical race theory, and I think that is more or less to do with the fact that legislation has been implemented over decades, and that is obviously in regards to combating racial discrimination, and yet it is still persistent in this country and in America. So I think we really should focus on what lays at the heart of critical race theory, as opposed to... What I find in these types of conversations is people tend to take a very complicated subject, such as CRT, which was obviously written by high-level academics, and they tend to reduce it to a set of headlining, grabbing kind of set of sound bites, so such as blackness equals victimhood, white people are oppressors. And I think naturally if we lead with these types of sound bites, of course, we are going to alienate people and stifle the debate, as opposed to having an open, frank conversation as to why these disparities continue to persist. So I think it is about being open-minded and really focusing on what the heart of critical race theory is actually about, as opposed to the things that divide us and tend to be quite divisive.
I'm glad you brought that up, and the way that it's very often been distilled into something that is polarising. You know, this idea of when people bandy about the term white privilege, it can feel very offensive to white people who, in their walk of life, perhaps they don't feel privileged at all. Do you think for that reason that the critical race theory belongs in a classroom? Is this not a conversation adults need to have? Because a lot of children, by and large, do have the sort of that lovely veil of innocence and almost sort of they don't tend to sort of recognise or develop prejudice tendencies. Those things get baked in more in adulthood. Do you think we need to be having this sort of conversation, the critical race theory conversation, in the classroom, or should it be among adults only?
I don't think racial prejudice or any type of prejudice kind of starts in adult life. It starts more or less as soon as you're born. You are consistently affected by everything, whether it's media, your family, your friends, your values. So I think having these conversations when you're young is important, because we all deal with racism, whether you're 8 or 10 or 50. So being able to have those open conversations and learn, I think, is what allows us to grow. And I think it really is important for us to continue to have these conversations, because if we don't, again, like I said, we keep kind of falling back into that same rhythm of a polarising conversation that leads nowhere. And we end up having the same discussion going round and round. So I think it is important.
Let's talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, it's something that we on this channel certainly know can be a powder keg. And sometimes to people, a very provocative movement. And, you know, they're sort of digging down into its Marxist roots and some of the other things that it proposes, defunding the police. I think a lot of people think, well, you know, we need our law and order. We need our law enforcement officers to have resources. Very often we keep hearing we don't have enough policemen. Do you find that the movement has helped move the debate forward, or are there parts of this that have actually seen some regression with the backlash that sort of came in its wake?
I do think that we are now having some really important conversations, and it's definitely kind of increased we now have a greater level of societal consciousness, I think. But definitely there has been kind of regression, and that's due to the fact that the racism has now come to light. It's always been there, but now people are very much kind of open and honest about how they feel when they get an opportunity to counter something like the BLM movement. So I think it's always been there, and now it's just come to the surface.
And have you felt any sort of personal change, you know, going through this whole experience and this whole journey? You know, from childhood, have you felt change has been for the better or for the worse? And now in the wake of BLM, do you feel that change, from what you've experienced, has been better or worse? Or is it sort of a mixture?
So I have always said the same thing consistently, which is we have transitioned. I've got a lovely fly that's been following me, so apologies. I've been doing a dance today.
Feel free to snatch
I know, right? I know. So I would say that in terms of our progression, really, in this country, I think we have transitioned from being overtly racist to covertly racist, and that's partly due to a change in law where there are now penalties for being overtly racist. However, that racial prejudice has not gone anywhere, and it still finds a way to manifest itself throughout society, whether it is at work, whether you are with friends. And so I think it's really important to just understand that basic kind of information, which is that racism hasn't actually improved. We've just transitioned to a different form of racism due to penalties. So that is probably the biggest difference, I would say. And I often find that in these types of situations, we as black people and brown people are expected to deal with these racial inequalities and these racial disparities without understanding causation. And in no other set of circumstances would that be okay. So I'll pose a question to you. If you went to the doctor for decades with symptoms that wouldn't go away for decades, and you were not told of the cause, and you were never given a cure, would you be happy with those set of circumstances?
No, quite.
You wouldn't.
Yeah.
And so is it fair to say that you are likely to seek advice from another doctor? You probably would. And so that is ultimately what we do in regards to critical race theory. It's an opportunity to delve into a different alternative perspective as to why these disparities and inequalities continue to persist. And that is something that we are currently dealing with to this day.
Do you think there's some truth in the idea that it's almost part of the human condition as societal animals, as tribal animals, fundamentally, anthropologically, that it's going to be impossible on both sides, not necessarily white people's views views of non-white people, but the other way around as well. Like, I'm a white woman who spent a lot of time living in sub-Saharan Africa, so I have been very much the racial minority in lots of different countries. But do you think that sort of picking at this scab and saying that, you know, we need to somehow get over this, there's a final hurdle before we reach utopia? I mean, can we? Or is this not just sort of baked into the human condition and somehow we've got to live with it, and actually constantly focusing on it is an irritant, it's exacerbating it?
So would you say that about a symptom that you have when you've gone to the doctor? If you've had a symptom on a rash on your arm for 10 years, would you be okay with the doctor saying, you know what, Alex, please just be okay with this. I can't give you a solution. I can't tell you what the cause is. You're just going to have to deal with it. You wouldn't find it acceptable, not under any circumstances. You would always seek to find causation. You will always seek to find a solution. This is what us as black and brown people have been doing for decades, hundreds and hundreds of years. So it is completely and utterly, quite frankly, disrespectful to have anyone say that we shouldn't be continuously having this conversation to find the cause. And critical race theory offers that alternative perspective.
And do you think we are getting there? Do you think that in your lifetime you're going to live in a society where you feel that we've reached the end point, we've got to exactly where we need to be as a society, the problems are now in the past, and we can all move forward, you know, in this sort of Martin Luther King, all of God's children join hands and say we are all free?
I don't think it will be in my lifetime, personally. I hope to God that it will be somewhere down the line, but I think it starts off just a clear understanding of these basic things. I heard another person that you were speaking to talking about definitions. Again, this is how we grow as human beings. If you don't understand something, then we can't continue to find ways to rectify it. So we need to understand the definition of white privilege. We need to understand the real definition of critical race theory in order to move forward. But I think that's where we are now, and I think it's going to take many years for us to all be on the kind of same level in terms of an understanding for institutionalized racism, an understanding of overt racism. Once we get to that understanding stage, I think then we can now start to find the appropriate solutions in regards to tackling institutionalized racism and racial disparities.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.